Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast here on June the 6th. Today, I'd like to discuss an update on our heat unit accumulation, give a service call update from this past week, and talk about scouting for black cutworm. So, let's begin by talking about our current heat unit accumulation. And in case you were wondering, yes, we are still behind. In fact, even with the recent warmer days, we fell behind by another 25 to 30 heat units in the last week. Now, this week, I looked at a planting date of May the 1st, and in the East Lansing area, we've accumulated 279 heat units. But in comparison to last year during the same time, we're down 161 heat units and 111 heat units behind that 5-year average. Going south to Coldwater, we are actually 180 heat units behind last year and 130 behind the 5-year average. And finally, going north to Mount Pleasant, we are 152 heat units behind last year and 103 behind the 5-year average. Though, it's been a slow start to the year, we still have plenty of time to get caught up and finish this crop on time. As for service calls this week, it's been interesting as always. From planter problems to all kinds of four-legged pests, plus disease, insect, frost, and some crusting issues. This has been one of those years where replant numbers are higher than average. Now, as for planter issues, I've actually had 2 different calls with 3 different issues. In one case, we had 3 corn rows that were consistently just not emerging as fast or as consistently as the remaining 13. Now, upon digging the seeds, we found that they were still firm and in pretty good condition. They just hadn't germinated or had just started to germinate. Now, the rest of the rows were at a solid V1 growth stage. It was all the same hybrid, and it was all delivered from the same center fill system, so the seed wasn't the issue. Now, upon working with the planter dealership, it was kind of figured out that there was an issue with the down pressure cylinder, and we just weren't getting good soil to seed contact on those 3 rows. Now, without good soil to seed contact, the seeds were just sitting in an air pocket and just waiting for enough moisture to start that germination process. Now, replant in this case, that would be a challenge because the seeds in those rows were now germinating with the recent rains, but they'll just continue to remain behind the rest of the crop and probably not have that consistency that we really desire in our corn crop emergence for obtaining those optimum yield potentials. Now, the other planter issue was a single row unit on a brand new planter where we were just really getting some poor emergence. Now, upon investigation there, we realized that when the fertilizer units were set up, they were set up only about an inch from the seed placement on most of the rows, and on this particular row, it was set virtually up on top of the seed itself. So fertilizer burns seem to be the culprit of these poorly germinating seeds, and again, replant will be difficult because, considering the population counts that we did have and the calendar date. So also on the same planter, it was kind of on a hilly field planted with a relatively small seed size. They just struggled getting good seed singulation. Now, though the population, when counting every plant in 17 feet 5 inches of row, it was acceptable, but the amount of doubles and triples and gaps with no seed dropped at all was just not acceptable. Now, this new planter had the ability to plant small seed, but, adjustments were just not made before planting to ensure that picket fence stand that we're all striving for each spring. The other interesting calls have actually been around animal damage. Lots of deer, woodchuck, and even some voles have wreaked havoc on our stands across the state. The problem is the problem is partially around the fact that in a normal year, we could outgrow some of the damage caused by these animals feeding in our fields. But with the crop growing so slow due to our slow heat unit accumulation, why the animals they're just eating faster than the crop can outgrow the damage. Replant was recommended in many of these calls, but replant without managing the pests doing the damage will only create a poor replant stand in the next few weeks. That just continues to be frustrating and hard to manage. On the insect and disease side of the service call experiences this week, I did confirm a field of Rhizoctonia down in southeast Michigan for soybeans that were sitting in that cold, wet soil for just too long. And I also confirmed some wireworm feeding where they just drilled holes right through the seeds and killed them before they even had a chance to germinate. So I often get questions though about how can we have these types of issues on treated seed? And that's a good question. Now, what we need to understand in these situations is that in order for an insect to die, it must first feed on the seed and ingest the insecticide. So the good news is that this will kill those insects that are feeding, but depending on the quantity of insects in a field, sometimes there's just too many all taking bites out of this protected seed. The results in those fields can be a reduced stand. In a similar way, fungicides are great protectants in slow emerging crops, but they too can be overcome with high disease pressures. Now, ultimately, I do believe that the protection provided by Cruiser Max Apex on our seed is a great choice, and it also sets you up for our 100% replant program if needed. Now, the last issue I wanted to discuss this week is around the arrival of Black Cutworm. Now, if you remember from a few months ago, I first mentioned some higher than normal black cutworm moth flights being found in traps in northern Ohio. And knowing that after they flew up here or were blown up here on the storms, they landed in green fields. Now, there they laid their eggs, and those eggs eventually hatched and are now in their larval stage, which is the cutworm itself. As they grow, they eat more and more, and if they were laid in fields that, were green a month ago, but now they're clean except for your growing crop, they will feed on whatever's available, including your crop. So, if you had cutworm eggs laid in your fields, the larvae are now large enough to start feeding, and most of that'll be done at night, and they just show up in the morning as cut plants. Just kind of like somebody went out in the field with a pair of scissors and just cut the plants right off. But during the day, they'll actually go and feed underground away from the sun, which is actually even worse because this is when they can feed on the growing point and kill those young corn plants. So your first priority, needs to be to check those fields that did have green growth this spring, like cover crops or maybe a lot of weed growth prior to planting. And for control threshold information, consider this information that I picked up from Purdue. They say that for primary leaf feeding, control may be needed if 3 to 5% of the plants show leaf feeding and two or more cutworms themselves can be found per 100 plants. Now, this management guideline is based on the assumption that for each 1% of plants with leaf feeding, there's a good chance that 3 to 5% of the plants will eventually sustain damage due to cutting or notching. Now, this does not mean that for each 1% of leaf feeding that you'll lose 3 to 5% yield. And not all damaged plants will be killed uh, for that damage out there. We lose some plants, but then those adjacent plants, they may yield somewhat more due to a little less competition. Now, sprays are going to be warranted if thresholds are met or exceeded. And for those fields, though, that are planted to a hybrid containing a broad lepidopteran trait, such as the Agrosure Viptera trait, damage should be fairly minimal. So, therefore, I'd probably scout those fields last. So, as we wrap up this week's Agronomy in Action Focus Friday podcast, let's continue to walk our fields. Remember, take a shovel and a seed digging tool and check on the development of your crop, especially underground development. If you're missing plants, dig up that area, see why. If you're digging soybean plants, you'll actually be excited to see that on those plants reaching their first full trifoliate, they're already starting to nodulate. So, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist, with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great week.